Chapter 15. Our Return to England. The day we left Letterjani, we were told that our division, together with the 51st Highland Division, was going back to dear old England. The news was totally unexpected, because we all felt certain that we were going to Italy to join up with the 8th Army. We were told that all stores and vehicles were to be handed over to a battalion which was taking our place. Anticipation was hard to conceal, and even our officers seemed to be very light-hearted. Another episode of my war was over. It was a great feeling to be told out of the blue that we were going home soon. Of course, then we did not know the reason for our return. The morning of 17th of October, 1943, found us travelling over the dusty tracks along which we had gone weeks ago, but this time there was no danger, and the journey was unforgettable. The track went back and forth across the sides of the mountain, then through all those miles of seedless grapes and tomatoes. The view across the whole landscape was fantastic. Nature was being very creative and extravagant when all this beauty, which became Sicily, arose out of the Mediterranean. Arriving at the port of Augusta, on the island's east coast, we boarded troop ship HMT Otranto and sailed the next morning. After my memorable journey on the Queen Mary, I soon came to the conclusion that I would not remember the Otranto with the same affection, apart from the fact that it was the ship which returned us to England. We were very crowded and most uncomfortable, and to add to the misery, the sea was rough, yet strangely I was not seasick, for which I was grateful. Maybe my earlier journey on the Queen Mary had prepared me in some way. We arrived at the port of Algiers on 25th of October, where we stayed for 2 days, and made the most of getting on deck if there was space. Then we were on our way again to North Africa, and I remembered all the ships and planes and lives which had been lost in this part of the Mediterranean during the siege of Malta, amidst the actions which had taken place to supply the island and also preventing supplies from reaching the Africa Corps. Arriving at Gibraltar, we only remained for 12 hours. Sadly, we couldn't go ashore, but I didn't hear anybody complain. Their thoughts were on more important destinations, for at the back of all our minds was that we were going back to England. The sea was rough again, passing through Biscay, but we were all good sailors by then, and the discomfort on board was bearable, because we were on the last lap to Blighty. We were told over the tannoy when we would dock, but not where. When was during the early hours of 5th of November 1943. Bonfire night coming up. Guy Fawkes. What a laugh! We'd seen enough fireworks to last a lifetime. Anyway, it was a pitch dark night and raining too, and for security reasons there was no brass band to welcome us home. We could not see any sign of England, not even the white cliffs of Dover, which I'd so remembered when I returned from Dunkirk. That seemed a lifetime away. But there would not be any white cliffs, because devastation was all around. This was wartime, bombed-out Liverpool in the blackout, and we could hardly believe our eyes at the battering it had received during the air raids. It was a sight that some of today's do-gooders should have had to live through, and they would then understand why we retaliated so fiercely against Germany. Not even our families knew our division was back in England. And right then we were really homesick and very, very tired. But it was a fantastic feeling to have the ground of our own country under our feet, even if it was wet, cold and windy. Some of the older boys who'd been away for 2.5 years, many away from their wives, had no idea of the battering England had gone through and what the people had suffered, and how they would relive the horrors of war for many years. But landing at Liverpool was not the end of the road for us. There were many sad moments to come, which would put our morale and stamina to the supreme test. What trauma yet awaited us? Thankfully then, none of us knew. Somewhere ahead lay our destination. Perhaps for a change and a miracle, we would be billeted in a town where we could see people, and better still, girls, English girls. But it was not to be. We ended up at a Nissen-hutted camp called Riddlesworth, which was 3 miles to the east of Thetford in Norfolk in the east of England. It was light by then, so we could see the camp with clarity, and other than the Nissen huts, the first impression was that it did not look bad. But first impressions could be deceiving, as we had discovered from the past, and we did not take things at face value. However, as billets go, it was acceptable, and more so because we had no sooner settled in than we were told that we would again be going on leave very soon. The 3 days we were waiting to go on leave were mostly spent on sleeping, letter writing or playing cards. Also, miracle of miracles for us, we actually had a naffy in camp where we could listen to another miracle, a wireless. We had never had such luxuries. We'd been paid for the first time in 4 months and issued with ration cards and travel warrants. We felt like lords. We had a good dinner to see us on our way, and we were off. Transport took us to the station. I must have travelled 17,000 miles since I left England. Now we'd returned and left hundreds of good boys behind, buried in foreign soil. How sad. This was one time we would not mind sitting on our kit bags in the corridor of the train, and we'd done that many times. We could even sleep like that. Just sitting there, reminiscing about yesterday, thinking of now or tomorrow, all gave way to somnolence. The trains were always crowded with uniformed personnel, so most of us did sleep anyway. There was no sing-song, because it wasn't as if the train was fully occupied by our own lads. But we didn't care so long as the train was travelling north, where most Greenhowards lived. Riddlesworth camp had been left with a skeleton staff to get the place organised for our return from leave. But our return was not on our minds now. All that mattered was indeed now. We'd seen enough of what happened to our tomorrows. Live for today. During my entire 6.5 years in the army, I was only granted 56 days leave, apart from the weekend passes I was able to get when I was within a reasonable distance from home. A funny thing always puzzles me even now. Although it was always a great feeling to be going home for a spell, I cannot recall anything significant about my leaves, except this one, after my return from the Middle East. Before the war, I was a member of the Methodist Church, so whilst I was on leave, I went to church and prayed for the pals who'd given their lives fighting for their country. I also thanked God for watching over me and bringing me home safely. Then there were several specific duties I had to perform, which were extremely trying and sorrowful. Firstly, I went to Stockton, which was only 6 miles from where I lived, to see John Bousfield's mother and 2 elder brothers. I told them John had been killed at Wadi Akarit, but I did not say how he had died. I said that these things happened so suddenly in war that John had gone to heaven without suffering. I'm afraid that they were so wrought with grief at the loss of their lad at only 19 years of age that there was no consoling them. I therefore came away very upset. Then to Arthur Oxley's home. I remember the remains of the shattered body it was my duty to bury at Akarit. Again, understandably, my visit to his mother turned to great sadness. Thank goodness there was no possibility of her knowing how her son had died. I had a pre-war pal called Don Savage. He was only 18 and a grand lad who'd been camped with me at Crediton near Devon in 1939. We'd been good friends. When he left the grammar school, he joined the RAF, becoming an air gunner on Lancasters. When he went on one of the bombing raids, he was posted missing, never to return. He was a splendid scholar at grammar school, and when I visited his home, his mother naturally was heartbroken. Then I went to see the parents of my pre-war pal, Bill Collings, killed on HMS York. They could not possibly know how their son had been killed. What an epistle this is. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, Bill had a younger brother, Vernon, who'd died from a fatal bug. Their parents were inconsolable. 2 lights in their lives had been extinguished. Well, I'd done my duty, but it was a dreadful leave. The only one where I vividly remember what I did. And those pitiful memories I will never forget. After my sad visits, I went home, and as usual, I had no sooner put my foot across the step than everybody wanted to know what I'd been up to during my time away, which was understandable. But for my own peace of mind, I didn't say anything about the gory details of death. I was soon on my way back to camp on the usual overcrowded trains, sitting in the corridor on my kit bag. There never seemed to be a seat on trains in those days, and there was always a long wait at transfer stations. I never had a problem about returning to my unit. I feel certain I missed the comradeship which is prevalent among soldiers, especially having fought together. Seeing so much death and at the same time watching out for each other, going through the same harrowing experiences, gives a lad a tremendous feeling inside. At Riddlesworth, most things had been organised, and it was great to be able to go to the NAFI when we were off duty. Just to sit on a chair, we never had chairs in our billets, and have a cup of tea, 1 penny, and a cake. We also had a good metal bed and 3 wool blankets, which was heaven, as it was a site very exposed to the elements, with a bitter cold wind. Mind you, it was November, and we had just returned from the hot climate of the Middle East. Come to think of it, comfort in the army in my day was a rare thing. Usually the only place we had to sit was our bed, and then more often than not we didn't even have that, as on many occasions we slept on a straw palliasse on the floor. During my whole time in the army, I never saw a bedsheet or even pyjamas, though they would have been a nuisance anyway. There was no serious training undertaken, as they were giving us all a good rest for what was to come, which was to be soon. Several trips were made to the firing range to keep our eyes up to standard and also to keep us occupied. When we left Sicily, all stores were left behind and taken over by the replacement units. Now, during 11 weeks at Riddlesworth, our division was being totally re-equipped to a much higher degree than ever before. All rifles, guns, trucks and Bren gun carriers had been brought in. It's strange in the army. One is either abroad fighting for one's life, never knowing the second one would be killed, or stationed in England, being bored to death, doing routine, everyday tasks. We had reveille at 0600 hours, a wash and shave in cold water, then PT, make up beds, mess time out, and a queue for breakfast. Then maybe a long route march in full kit, taking turns carrying the Bren gun. Trouble was that there were no avenues of pleasure to relieve the boredom, just the same old tough routine. We had no illusions about our return to England. Although the war was going well, it was far from over, and there would be much for our division to do to help to bring it to a successful conclusion. The invasion scare was well and truly now part of history, and therefore the next episode in the struggle must be the invasion of Europe. But at that time nobody knew anything about the role that our 50th Division would play. Our division had seen a great deal of active service and was staffed, in the main, by very competent officers. We knew that we'd been brought home so we could make a major contribution towards bringing the Germans to their knees. At Riddlesworth, I was kept rather busy as I once more took up my job as company officer's cook. The guard would wake me up at 0500 hours every morning, and after I'd performed my ablutions, I'd make my way to the officers' mess hut, which included a kitchen with a first-class range. Next to it was a dining room, which was in turn next to a very comfortable officers' mess. I would make myself a cup of tea around 0520 and prepare for the cooking of breakfast. Next came early morning tea for the officers, which the batmen would collect to awaken their officer. After breakfast, I'd go to the main cookhouse and draw rations for the day. There was always an excess, so nobody, including the men, went short. After breakfast, the duty officer would see me to discuss the menu for the day, depending upon what rations had been issued. I never had a problem being able to converse with our officers. They were always willing to talk easily with the other ranks, and I know all the ranks appreciated it. Having settled on the menu, I would tidy the kitchen because I was scrupulous and liked to be organised in many ways. I didn't have need for any assistance in the kitchen, since there were only 5 officers and yours truly. At about 1000 hours, my pal Jack Spooner from Sheffield, who was on the staff in the orderly room, would call in for a chat and a cup of tea with me. He once typed out the words to Lily Marlene for me. He was a good sort, Jack, and we were good mates. An officer might sometimes pop his head in the door and ask, "Any tea on the go, Cheall?" I always made fresh tea. I hated the brew, which was permanently on the stove, and where one just added more water and tea till the spoon stood up in it. Cocoa was always on the go at supper time. If only I could have looked 50 years ahead, I would have seen my wife and me moving home to live very happily in a village near Cambridge and only 20 miles from Riddlesworth, which I now pass very often. The cosy setup at Riddlesworth was not to last too long, because during the third week of January 44 we packed up once again. It was to be Southwold in Suffolk this time, right on the coast, and we were billeted in requisitioned private hotels on the edge of the small town. But almost all the time we were short of money, and a visit to the pub for a drink was a real night out. Still, Southwold was fine. At this time we were lucky enough to have a show put on for us by Cyril Fletcher at the Pier Theatre. But we had no sooner settled in than we thought, "They're mucking us about again," a remark often passed in those days. All the new stores and equipment we'd received at Riddlesworth so recently were withdrawn, and everything was replaced. But it was not our job to wonder why, just to do it. I was still cooking at Southwold, and made my pal a wedding cake there. Training was beginning in earnest, as we received many new recruits here who'd never seen active service, and they had to be toughened up. But it was a different kind of training to what we'd been used to in the Middle East. We used different methods of attack and deployment, using sections, platoons and companies. We had in fact to learn a new art of warfare almost from scratch. It seemed stupid to us at the time, but eventually in Normandy we realised the purpose behind the apparent madness. It was the bocage, the hedgerows, but more of that later. It was a good billet overlooking the green at Southwold. I went back years later and showed my wife where I'd done my cooking. Unfortunately, another move was on the cards, and in 4 weeks we were on the way yet again to a new training ground. Chapter 16. Intensive Training. It was March 1944, and the time had come for a higher intensity of training, to be fit and ready for any eventuality. We were to become even more skilled at beating the enemy at his own game. It was going to be tough, rough and concentrated, and apparently we would wish we had never been born, so said the instructors. We wondered what it was that we were being taken to. We would soon find out. We were on a troop train bound for, well, that was anybody's guess. All we knew was that we were heading north. So kit bag seats to ease our discomfort were not needed, as no other members of the forces were with us, so there was seating for us all. No wartime soldier will ever forget journeys such as those. There were the card games and the good wartime songs, which 50-odd years later are still sung with gusto. Enjoying every second, we were real pals. Those songs, many of which were sentimental, made us think of home. All that without the swill they all drink today. No rowdyism or punch-ups, just honest-to-good comradeship. It was great. Then we would all sleep the sleep of the just, until the train jolted to a stop, waking us up. No, we hadn't arrived at wherever we were going, but there, waiting for us on the platform, were the faithful ladies of the Salvation Army and Women's Voluntary Service. "Come on, lads, it's hot, sweet and strong." For security reasons, we were never told where our destination was, and of course this made sense. It wouldn't do for Tommy to write home saying that 50th Division were going to such and such a place. Somebody said that walls had ears, but it seemed a hell of a long way, and since we were travelling north, it had to be Scotland. At the time, we had never heard of Inverary, northwest of Glasgow. So this was Scotland in early March. It wasn't just cold, it was bloody cold. Inverary was a small town of about 450 people on Loch Fyne. We were going to get to know all about the course here in a little while. Still, it was somewhere different, so very different and desolate. I had never been to Scotland, but I was going to get to know it and love it over the next 18 months. But at the time, there were other more demanding things to be done, and not very pleasant at that. The reason for the training we were about to undergo, apart from making us very fit, was not apparent to us then, but it became very obvious when in June we were enlightened about many things we'd been curious about. During our stay in Inverary, the weather was dreadful, and we never experienced such bitter cold, pouring rain and snow. But the weather hadn't to interrupt our training. The place was rough and tough, and any weaknesses in our condition soon surfaced. Now we knew why those Scots boys of the 51st Division were a hardy lot. We'd say, God, who would live in Scotland? But that was at the start of the course. Later, when we realised how weak we'd been and how perfectly fit we were at the end, well, Scotland wasn't so bad after all. The camp had been very specially prepared so that the soldiers completing the course would be at the peak of their physical fitness. When we left, there would be no weaklings amongst us. This was a commando training course, and it was to prepare us for strenuous times ahead. We were billeted in Nissen huts once more, but these, because of the climatic conditions, were very warm and comfortable. Each hut stood in its own clearing, and all the huts were nestled amongst tall pine trees. How the wind howled through them! Everywhere looked desolate, wind-blown, and very wintry, without any amenities or comfort whatsoever. Roll on time. The course hadn't even started yet. There was not going to be any spare time for us. It was a slog from the beginning to its conclusion. What a life! We were told to stop moaning. It was not going to be a rest cure, but a kill-or cure, and it cured us. There were no common colds, and sick parades weren't allowed. If there was anything wrong, tough, just get on with it. That was discipline with a capital D. We really got stuck into what had to be done, although the first day or two played havoc with muscles we didn't know we had. We were urged on continually by regular commandos with all sorts of training. On the second day, we did a forced march in torrential rain, never allowed to stand still, running up and around mountainsides and crawling through swampy ground and ditches half full with mud until we were up to the eyes with filth. We went across ropes suspended over the river, which was fast flowing, though only 3 feet deep. 2 of the boys fell into the water, but there was a net across to stop them drifting away. There were ropes tied on strong branches of the trees, and we had to climb up hand over hand. Everything was most strenuous. We also had a go at storming a beach from a landing craft. I wonder why we thought we would be taking part in an invasion. It was no place for the faint-hearted. As each day passed, we all became fitter and fitter, and it felt great. We were very well fed, with good, wholesome food, and being kept on our toes, the end of the course soon came in sight, and time seemed to have passed quickly. On the last evening, drink was provided, and we all made merry and sang our heads off. The 2 weeks of hell were behind us. It was a sight for sore eyes when we saw 3-tonners lined up to collect us and take us to, again, nobody knew where. We felt not a bit sorry. We felt not a bit sorry for the battalion taking our place. Poor devils didn't know what they were in for. While we were at Inverary, many of the boys who'd been in the campaign in Africa went down with malaria, but I was one of the lucky ones. I learned at the end of the war that 50th Division had been brought back to England to land in Europe on the 3rd day. But quite suddenly, our role was changed and we were to take part in the initial assault, many of us having the experience of active service. Monty said this was a tribute to the fighting qualities of our division, which had been proven in North Africa and Sicily. This was the reason for the specialised training we were undergoing from the time we arrived at Inverary until we went into our confined camps ready for D-Day. But at the time, for security reasons, we were not aware of the real reason. This also was the reason for us being re-equipped for the second time since our return to England, and also why we were to spend a great deal of time on amphibious operations from February to June 1944. We drove through the pleasant little town, waving to the folk and passing right alongside Inverary Castle, and it really was a picture. We passed it only too quickly, making our way to Stirling railway station, where our special train was waiting for us, and the lights in the coaches looked most welcoming. The mountains looked fantastic with their snow caps on. At that particular time, there were no regrets about leaving Scotland, but I did not realise at the time that I would be back in no time at all, and came to love what I saw and experienced with great pleasure. The seeds of future friendship had been sown. The lads were making imaginary bets about where we were going, but this time none of us really cared, knowing that it must be somewhere in southern England. Meantime, the train sped on its way, stopping only long enough to have a mug of tea to go with the cheese sandwiches we'd been given when we left camp, and to stop for a good hot stew, which had been arranged ahead of us. There were always our friends, the redcaps, waiting at every exit of the station to make sure nobody went AWOL, absent without leave, or as the boys used to say, bugger off. Back in the train, and the doors all clanged shut. We would settle down to snooze, our minds a blank. It would have been good to have a dream of home, perhaps even a dream that the war had ended. The following lines are taken from my diary, and which I wrote a week after it had happened. We had a long train journey before us, and as we passed through the countryside of southern England, our troop train went under a bridge. All of a sudden, there was such a terrible screeching and crashing of coaches. As the coach, which was second behind mine, was going under the bridge, a lorry smashed over the parapet and crashed between two coaches across the couplings and separated the train. The first coach just seemed to concertina, and the following three carriages reared over it. They came off the rails and ploughed into the field on the left, turning onto their sides. It was a good thing the track was accessible from the road, about 300 yards away, and it didn't take long for the services to be on the scene. Injured and dead Green Howards lay all over the place. How could anything so tragic happen to us? Only minutes or even seconds before, the lads were singing, joking, or sleeping. How could God let it happen? They were mostly good boys who, because of our calling and profession and experiences, believed in the Almighty, and although not ardent in their church-going, prayed often. This tragedy should not have happened. How awful for the families of those who'd been killed. Many of them had faced death in North Africa and Sicily, surviving the bitterness of conflict, only to be plucked from the prime of their lives in England. The reality of it was beyond belief. We'd all seen sudden death many times, so our officers quickly organised us into sections to help the services with the clearing up operation. The greatest sadness was lifting the broken bodies onto the ambulances. Surely this hadn't happened to the lads who'd strained every sinew in their bodies during training in Scotland to be fit, only to be killed in the twinkling of an eye in this way. We had to hang around for some time whilst another train was brought up the line, and climbing aboard, we were all quiet, looking back at that tragic scene and somehow settling ourselves again. For quite a while, none of us spoke of any particular pal who'd been taken from our midst. For professional reasons, we had to overcome the enormity of the accident. But for the remainder of the journey, there was no singing, or jokes, or hilarity. We would remember today. It was 13th of March, and Boscombe, Hampshire, was our next stop. The town was only about 9 miles from Highcliffe, where I was billeted in 1940. During our stay at Boscombe, we lived in a very good hotel called the Burlington, which had been requisitioned and was now always occupied by troops. It was a splendid, large building on the cliff top, about 500 yards from the beach. We would fall in platoons and run along the road, then down about 40 steps and across a pedestrian bridge, then down a zigzag path to the beach and do a 2-hour stint of strenuous exercise, and then we would run lengthwise in 2 feet of sea. It was too bad if we fell over. Apart from the training on the beach, we did have a good rest here. It was all a laugh after Inverary. The stay was easy, and we slept like logs on our palliaces. Well, who needed luxury accommodation anyway? We did. The only real training was every 3rd day, when we'd be transported to bombed-out buildings at Southampton and made practice attacks on part-demolished property. We shouted and yelled at an imaginary enemy, and using live hand grenades, gained experience at street fighting. This was a thing we had never done before, even at Inverary. The experience was invaluable to us, and probably more so to the NCOs and officers who'd not been in action before, having joined us as replacements for casualties sustained in the Middle East. It's strange how small things stick in one's mind. Just 100 yards from our billet, there was a small cafe run by the YMCA, to which we had to climb 10 steps, It was great because we did have some spare time then and used to sit and chat over a cup of tea or beans on toast and other light meals, as well as cakes, and listen to the wireless. What luxury! Boscombe, apart from the pubs, was a typical seaside town in winter, although that was acceptable since it was the first time I had actually been stationed right in a town, and the residents were very tolerant towards us. Well, we were all good lads, weren't we? But this short respite soon came to an end, and once again we were on the move, going to Swanage and Weymouth, finishing up in no time at all with a return visit to Studland Bay. Here we learnt new techniques about landing on the coast from landing craft, carrying the utmost weight of equipment and weapons. In those days it was a desolate dump, but at the end of the day we were there to do specialised invasion exercises, not to take a holiday. After being taken out to sea a couple of miles, the assault craft would turn around and at speed make for the beach. We jumped into 3 feet of water after the ramp went down, then hastened up the beach to attack an imaginary enemy, just as in the Gulf of Aqaba before Sicily. Of course, we were certain that we would be invading somewhere in the not-too-distant future. It was all very well assaulting a beach, but it's the live ammunition which makes the difference. I got the impression that it was the intention of a higher authority to make us as wet as possible, as often as possible, and then to send us on a cross-country manoeuvre whilst our clothes dried out on us. But this did not even begin to give us an idea of what the real invasion would be like. We did several long route marches and exercises around Corfe Castle and back without any halts. It all seemed rather elementary after the training in theory and actual battle conditions we'd experienced, but it kept us at the peak of fitness, ready for the fray we felt could not be too far away, and for which there had been very little precedent for the massive operation facing us. Yet strangely enough, we seemed to have an insatiable appetite for action. Studland Bay was only a short stay, and the beginning of April saw us at yet another place. Chapter 17. Time for action. Studland Bay had been rather bleak, and once again we were pleased to be on the move, always on the move. I don't know how the military kept in touch with where we were, but my record has every detail of my movements. All credit is due to the Records Office. The first week in April 1944 found us at a new campsite in bell tents which had been erected in a field of short grass. It was Bushfield Camp, 2 miles outside of Winchester. We certainly got around in the army. I recall we were under canvas and luckily it was good weather. The battalion field kitchen was set up in the middle of the field, and at meal times the bugle would blow and the lads would grab their mess tins and eating irons and join long queues in order to be served with their meal, which was usually plentiful. But I don't know why the army could not have provided waitress service for its infantry. In the field adjoining ours, there were some American soldiers who appeared to be from a different planet. Their attitude seemed to be easy-going and casual. No bell tents for them, but good square tents with 3-foot walls holding about a dozen soldiers. We had 6 to a tent. The smell from their kitchens was fantastic. They even had doughnuts for afters. We had rice pudding most times. I didn't think they looked as fit as we were, and they appeared to be casual in their movements, but they were very well equipped, and I was sure that they would give a good account of themselves when the time for action came. They were our allies, and it was hoped that we could learn from one another. They were very good-natured and always greeted us as friends. Being the first US soldiers we'd come across, we were certain to get along well. They were okay. We were taking it easy at Bushfield Camp, as everything was so relaxed. It wasn't natural to have so much time to ourselves. They must have thought we needed a rest. We spent more time cleaning our weapons than ever before, which was not a bad idea, since our lives could depend upon them. I think that right now, 50 years on, I would love to recapture some of the atmosphere of those days and get my hands around a Bren gun and Lee Enfield rifle, just to handle them and clean them. I did foot slog into Winchester a couple of times, but it wasn't my sort of place. A week after arriving at Bushfield, we were on the move again, moving ever closer to the day we knew nothing about yet, but felt that it could not be so far off. The new camp was a great contrast to Bushfield, and we were not going to like it. Again, bell tents, always 1914 to 18 bell tents, which had been pitched upon trees on stubbly grass, and the ground was sandy, ideal for the colonies of ants which pestered us. It was the second week of May 1944, and we were 3 miles from Romsey on the Winchester Road, which passed about 20 yards from our tent. It was drizzling with rain much of the time, and weapon cleaning was a nightmare, not exactly a tonic to put us in high spirits. For a few days at first, only routine work was done, and we made a few hikes into Ringwood. We did not know at the time that we would be at Romsey until the great day, but things were becoming very intriguing. Around 23rd of May, outgoing mail was suddenly stopped, and we were confined to camp. Yet I can recall that the camp was not guarded to keep us in, as it was only a verbal order, which was obeyed without any questions being asked. Anyway, who would want to go to the nearest pub and talk his head off and perhaps jeopardise the whole thing? In any case, all bus and railway stations would be watched by the Redcaps, and they stood no nonsense. They'd be on the lookout all over the south of England for any soldiers going AWOL. Significant events were taking place. During this period, we had not been enlightened about any plans, but we did not have to wait long. Our officers obviously knew more about the goings-on than we did, and they were not saying. It appears that our 50th Northumbrian Division and the 51st Highland Division had been brought home from Sicily to land on the continent after the first day. Then Monty changed plans for a wider frontal assault. 50th Division would now have to go in with the initial assault. A large tent had been erected among the trees, and each platoon in turn surrounded a sand table and looked eagerly on while a senior officer with a long cane demonstrated. The display was about the size of a table tennis table and covered with about 2 inches of sand, with miniature tanks and buildings of all kinds. This was the first time we'd seen a sand table, and it showed every possible detail which we had to recognise when we landed. The way in which it had been set up was fantastic, and we had looks of bewilderment and a genuine attitude of interest on our faces. The long side of the table represented the seaward side, showing models of all the obstacles the military knew we would have to face during the assault. Then, behind the beach, there was a replica of everything we would find on the enemy coast. We all had our own sector to assault, and on it, houses and all buildings, fences, tracks, hedges, streams and walls were depicted. We had to remember every detail, as our lives could depend upon it, and we should be able to see our position exactly in relation to other platoons and companies of the battalion. Naturally, we were not given any details about when or where in the world we would be landing. We were well aware of the need for paramount security. The planning was on an incredible scale. Officers explained everything we needed to know about our area. Considering the variety of training and exercises we'd been undergoing during the past few weeks, it was obvious that we would be playing a significant role in any invasion, whenever it came. All kinds of questions were encouraged except about where it was going to be. It was a miracle how everything was kept so secret. Our lives would certainly depend upon security. We also received an hour-long pep talk from our commanding officer about what was expected of us and the general state of the war situation, the intention being to boost our morale. However, there was no cause for concern. Our spirits were never better. The Green Howards were a grand bunch of lads from the North Riding of Yorkshire, and no squarehead was going to have it all his own way when we were finally confronted by him. We had to avenge Dunkirk, and the enemy was going to find out what a fighter the British soldier was. The newer recruits would not be able to imagine what the rest of us had seen during those anxious days for our country, but they were good boys, as we older and wiser lads knew well. It was unnecessary for us to motivate them. We knew where all our priorities lay. Upon reflection, the pre-invasion days were amazing. Many seeds of friendship were sown during that momentous period. It was to be a time which would go down in history, and our division was to play a significant part in the making of that history. As we were all undergoing all this enlightenment around the sand table, other things were taking place on the road just yards away from us. Heavy vehicle noise made any further talks impossible, so we went to investigate. Overhanging trees forming an archway covered the road, which ran a matter of 15 yards from our tent, and there was a 6-foot grass verge. As far as the eye could see, armoured vehicles, trucks and guns of all sizes were parking on the grass verge, nose to tail, on both sides of the road. It was a most incredible sight, and we had never seen anything like it. There were hundreds of 1,500-weight trucks, 3-tonners, 25-pounders, anti-tank guns and many other weapons of war. But the most impressive sight was the tanks. Tanks we never knew existed, and at that time we did not know what their role in the war would be. We soon found out. They were to be known as Hobart's armour, named after the warfare expert Percy Hobart, who invented them. Today, all these new ideas are common knowledge, but in 1944, the lads couldn't stop talking about what we were seeing. It was something we would never see again. The armour continued to build up, and there were tanks with flamethrowers on the front of them. Tanks with revolving chains, flails, on a drum on the front to beat the ground and explode mines. Tanks which could lay a matting in front of them to go over soft sand and over soft banks. They looked so incongruous, having their exhausts high in the air and the engines waterproofed so they could travel through water. All these vehicles were to land on the first day and needed to be so equipped until we had a port. This all must have been a monumental task. While we were at Romsey, it was impossible to comprehend the meaning of whatever we saw and heard. How could we have imagined the momentous decisions which had taken place concerning what was necessary to be done, in order to free Europe, or what part of our 50th Division had to play alongside other units taking part in the initial assault. There was much for us to be told about before we set foot on the beaches which the enemy seemed determined to deny us. But we would be going into the attack with a determined state of mind about the formidable task facing us. There was no doubt about our resilience. We knew that every eventuality had to be provided for, and felt confident that we could make a successful landing. What had been instilled into our thoughts was the fact that we must succeed. We were very perceptive about what had been done to aid us in every way. On 31st of May, all kit except that which we would carry had to be handed into the stores. I made sure my 2-inch mortar was clean. That would be staying with me. End of chapter 17.